It's funny. I was at a dinner the other day, and I was a very young historian next to me, and she was talking about, thinking strategically. That was the phrase she used, thinking strategically about her career. And I sort of did a double take, and I thought, I don't think I've ever thought strategically in my life. Right? I've never had a plan, and I know that's probably sounds awful, but I just haven't. I've just followed my nose, and I've done what I enjoy doing. I'm working on the next book, so I've been busy writing about U-boats, which is quite good fun. So no, I've just been doing that this morning. That's all.
Ooh, so
and
what's
I walk
the next?
Dog.
What's the next book about?
It's about the U-boat war in World War II, but from a German perspective. So, where the story is conventionally told from the viewpoint of the surface, I'm sort of flipping that to tell it from the perspective of the U-boats themselves and what they went through and what they experienced and what they thought what they were doing and all that sort of thing. So it's a familiar story, but told from an unfamiliar perspective.
Cool. And how's the writing process going?
Yeah, good. I enjoy it. I like the writing is, you have to enjoy it, really. Doing a job like that, you have to enjoy it because it's quite hard work. There's no, and it's, again, no one's going to be standing over your shoulder and rattling your cage and telling you to get up and do whatever it is. You've got to motivate yourself. So that means you kind of have to enjoy what you're doing. But I do. I actually quite like the solitude of it. I like the challenge of having, a mass of information and having to prune that down into something that sort of makes sense and is true to that mass of information and yet is sort of readable and provides a narrative and all of that sort of thing. So that process I sort of find quite, intellectually stimulating, exciting. So yeah, I like it. I enjoy it. I wouldn't do it if I didn't.
Do you work on it every day?
Yeah.
How many hours a day?
Probably not enough. There's too many, distractions and emails and other things and going to the gym and whatever. But probably, a good, I don't know, on average, probably 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day, probably. But then, there's always other stuff in the way. And other projects and book reviews and, I do a bit of teaching. So there's always other stuff that gets in the way as well.
Huh. And when's this one going to be out?
In 18 months about from now. So I deliver at the end of the year and then the publishers take an absolute eternity in production. So it'll be out in the spring of 26, which feels like a lifetime away. But there it is.
Why do they take so long?
That's a very good question. I mean, that you'd have to ask them. They used to work on the basis of sort of 9 months production. And in the last few years, that's gone up to sort of, 15, 16, 17 months. And it was kind of hard when it was 9 months production. It was kind of hard to work out from my perspective as author, what the hell they were doing for 9 months. So, that question is all the more pressing now that they're saying it's 15, 16 months. So, God only knows what they do. I mean, it's, to be fair, the editorial side is pretty thorough and pretty good. And that's all. That does take some time. It doesn't take 15 months. So there's a bit of a question as to precisely why it takes so long.
Interesting. Okay, I don't usually do introductions, but Have you ever chat GPT'd yourself?
No. What does that even mean?
It means looking up your name on ChatGPT.
Okay, no.
So
I'm worried now.
It's great. Okay. So because I just was listening to The Forgers, your latest book, on Audible, narrated by you.
Yes.
But I wanted ChatGPT to just quickly summarize like all your other books for me. So I typed in your name, and I thought you might appreciate hearing what it said. So it says Roger Moorhouse, British historian, blah blah blah, focusing on Nazi era, and then it has your notable works, some of Morehouse's notable works: Berlin at War, Devil's Alliance, Killing Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
The Polish War. It didn't know, it actually let me down because it's only updated to 2022. So it didn't know about the Forgers. And it was telling me that I was wrong, that you hadn't written a book called The Forgers, which is not helpful.
No, I definitely have.
But at the end, it has this little paragraph that says, Roger Moorhouse is known for his meticulous research, engaging writing style, and ability to present complex historical events in a compelling manner. His works contribute significantly to our understanding of the Nazi regime, the complexities of wartime alliances, blah, blah, blah. I was like,
That's
wow,
nice.
did you write this yourself? So nice.
Sounds like I did, but no, I didn't. No, that's very. I don't know where that came from. I mean, I suppose they Chat GPT sort of picks these things up. I suppose it trawls the web and picks stuff up. Is that right? So I mean, if that's if that's been written somewhere, then that's very, very satisfying. Yeah. If I were to write it, I would write that, because that's kind of, that as I just described, that idea of sort of boiling down a mass of information into something vaguely compelling. I do see that as what I do. So yeah, that's nice.
Cool. Okay, so before we get to how you became obsessed with World War II, I guess, let's talk about how you grew up.
Yeah. Well, Hertfordshire. I was actually born in Stockport in the northwest. For strange sort of family reasons, my grandmother was a GP in Stockport, and she insisted that I was born there under her probably nominal supervision, but she wanted to go and be present and so on. So I was born in Stockport, and then brought up in Hertfordshire, which is just outside London, about 40 minutes outside London, northwest. Quite reasonably rural, in the Chiltern Hills, which is quite a nice area. So that's where I spent the first 17 years. I left home when I was 17. So I spent all my time there, which was lovely. It was quite sort of idyllic, really, looking back. My parents ran a pub, so my dad was the landlord of the pub. And yeah, so we lived above the pub, and that was my childhood. It was kind of weird in some ways, that my parents, because they was working, and it's quite an intense job doing that. They were more or less absent from my childhood and my older brothers, so we were kind of left to our own devices to some extent, which is kind of a good thing and a bad thing. As you can imagine, two boys together get up to all sorts of things upstairs. So yeah, it was kind of weird when you look back, but you never know. You never have that perspective as a child. You never have that sense of looking into your own life from the outside. So it was probably quite strange, but nonetheless, an entirely sort of benign environment. So that they were both very sort of caring and so on. I got on particularly well with my dad. Yeah, so probably reasonably standard in that respect.
Was it a good pub?
Yeah, it was. It was quite well regarded at the time. My dad was he's an interesting guy. He was born in 1927, so he was quite an old dad. So when I was born, he was already 41, and he'd sort of worked his way up from nothing, really. He was born in Liverpool, and he'd done his whole life, his whole working life in hospitality, so hotels and so on. And had started as a lift boy in the Adelphi in Liverpool, famous hotel in Liverpool, and then ended up he was managed the Glen Eagles Hotel, which is very very prominent hotel in Scotland, and then he went off and did his own thing and became a publican, ran a pub and ran the restaurant as well. So he used to cook for the restaurant, and my mum was kind of front of house, and he used to do all the cooking and so on. And the pub was very well regarded at the time, so it was a good place. People used to come to eat there. It was a little bit, I suppose, almost preempting the sort of gastropub phenomenon, of people having a destination to go to because the food was good or the ambience was good, whatever it was. So yeah, it was very well regarded. Yeah.
Is it still running?
It is still running. It was actually derelict for a long time because it went downhill. So my dad retired in the mid-80s, and it sort of went down very slowly and then very rapidly went downhill, and then eventually was left, pretty much derelict. And it's just been refurbished and reopened and taken on by a new owner. So good luck to it. I hope they manage to make a good fist of it.
Cool. And where did your mum grow up?
My mum was born in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and with her family they moved to Stockport, so near Manchester, and she grew up there. So, and hers was a kind of slightly odd childhood. So her mother, as I said, was a GP, and her father was also a GP. So he'd fought in the war. We know this now. So we didn't know this at the time because it was never talked about. So again, this is a kind of generational thing that I think nowadays people are much more open about things like this. But for my parents' generation, none of this was ever talked about, and it only ever came out sort of either at the very end of their lives or even sort of after their deaths, when you sort of go through these sort of rather dog-eared manila envelopes that you find in drawers after they've passed away, But yeah, so her father, also GP, he served in the war, the Royal Army Medical Corps, all the way through 39 to 45, which must have been grim as an army doctor, and evidently coped with the stress of that by drinking and came back an alcoholic, which rather played havoc with his home life, as you can imagine. So that ended up with a rather messy divorce, and the two girls, so my mum and her sister, her elder sister, being brought up by her mother, who was quite a stern woman, and then her sister died of cancer in her mid-20s, quite early, and so my mum was sort of bereft from that. So I think there was a lot of unmanaged grief, we could say, in my mum, both from the divorce and not growing up without a father, and then losing her sister, who was really her big sister, was like a role model sort of thing. She was the outgoing, the one that had all the good school results and all of that, and my mum was a little bit in her shadow. So so my mum had some issues, but which I don't think she ever worked through properly, because people that generation just didn't. She just bottled them all up and carried on. That's how it was. So that's why, as I say, I think that, we're looking back, I think that might be why, there was a rather strained relationship a little bit with my mum, but, that's how it was.
She never talked about it?
No. Never talked about any of that stuff. So when I had a phase a few years ago now, probably 20 years ago, where I sort of went into doing a bit of genealogy and stuff, which a lot of people go through that. And I did ask her some questions then, and she would just sort of screw up her face and say, "No, I can't. I'm not. Not talking about that." So she wouldn't just not talk about it. She would actively refuse to talk about it.
Really? What kind of questions?
Oh, just like, just basic stuff, like, stuff about her father. What does she know about her father? So all that I know about him, I've had to pick up from, accessing his military record and things like that, and sort of newspaper clippings, for example. So, Yeah, I mean, she was just very much a closed book on all of that stuff. She just didn't want to go there. So that was obviously her coping strategy, which is, in retrospect, that's fine. But I think she was very adept at bottling stuff up.
So you never met him?
Not that I know. He died in the early 70s, so when I was still very small, and so I don't think I ever did. I certainly don't remember him.
And so that would have been unusual, was it, that your grandma was a GP?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, less so by that stage. I mean, when she was young, so she went to university in Belfast, so Queen's Belfast. So when she was there, that was still unusual for women to be at university, sort of doing medicine. By the time, by the sort of 70s or whatever, there were many more women as GPs, but probably not those with the amount of experience that she had. She was already quite long in the tooth, and she died in the early 80s. So she'd been serving as a GP all the way through, the post-war years. So that was probably unusual, but less unusual by the 70s, I suppose.
Mm.
She's quite a formidable woman, my grandmother. I always found her quite terrifying, I'll be honest.
Interesting. Okay, so what did your parents want for you when you were growing up?
That's a tough one to answer, I think, because as I said, I think their parenting style was very hands off, to the extent that the phrase I always use to explain this to myself is that I was raised by wolves, because it was a benign environment, certainly. So there's nothing, never anything untoward, but it was definitely, it redefined hands off, I would say. So they were very busy. They were downstairs and working, and I was either at school or I was out on my bike or I was upstairs, usually being beaten up by my brother. But I was just doing other things, and actually parental involvement in most of that, apart from being fed, was kind of minimal. I'll be honest. So it's like, again, it's a generational thing. I like with my kids, I used to go to every rugby match, for example, my son ever played, I think I went to. I played rugby for 5 years at school to a reasonably high level. My dad didn't watch once, and that was partly because pressure of work or whatever it was, but it was also generational. It was just what would the expectations that were made on parents. So from their point of view, they were providing a safe and happy household, and providing food and care and love and all that, and that was enough. Now, what to go back to your question, what did they want from me? I don't even know. That was never a discussion that was had. It was, that I sort of made the best of myself. I don't know, no idea.
So you didn't get any kind of feeling of what they would have because it could be like, oh, you can't be a Marxist, or you can't be a banker, or like you have to start working, like you have to make money, or
there's none of that. I mean, it's interesting because I did drop out of school when I was 16, and that, I suppose, was the only time that there were any discussions like that at all, and that was with my dad. And it was a brief, I'd say, discussion. It was a very brief conversation. So when so I had a school report that came back, and it basically said that I was I was being a pain in the arse, and I think the phrase that was used was Mr. Moorhouse, referring to my dad. Mr. Moorhouse, you're wasting your money. So okay, I mean, that you can imagine how well that went down. So I said, well, I'll leave then. And he said, well, okay, so what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'll go and get a job. And at the time I had a motorbike. I'd bought a motorbike, a few years before, and I was kind of obsessed. I used to sort of, take it apart and put it back together and see if it worked and things like that. And that was kind of, if I had a fascination at that stage in life, it was that. So I said, well, I'll go and train as a mechanic. I'll do that, right? And my dad sort of, he probably winced, but he thought, well, and he actually said, well, if you get a trade, then, you sort of never want for work, if you get a decent trade behind you, regardless of what you end up doing. So that was, he was very alive to that, because he didn't have that, as we now have this sort of innate snobbery, particularly among middle classes, about, must go to university, must get a degree. With the result that we are frightfully short of, plumbers and carpenters. He was quite open to that, because that's the world that he'd come from. As I said, he'd started out as a lift boy in a hotel, and worked his way up, and that had sustained him throughout his life. So he was quite happy for that prospect. So that's what I did. I left school, I'd spent 2 years training as a car mechanic, which was very interesting. It paled after a while, and then I ended up falling out with one of my bosses, and that was it. So then I moved on to something else. But in terms of what he wanted for me, no, there was never any real guidance. That was the only time I think we ever had that sort of conversation, and it was, yeah, okay, well, you go and do that then.
But you're going to a fee-paying school.
Yeah.
So they valued education.
Yeah. Yeah. In a very sort of passive kind of way. So my older brother was, I found this out much later on. My older brother was paid for by my grandmother. He was a little bit the golden child. So his fees and so on were paid for by my grandmother. And apparently my dad said, you can't send him and not the other one. So my parents paid for me to go to the same school. So yeah, I mean, again, but there were no conversations about it that, you must do well and must, we're paying money for this, so you've got to, that just didn't happen. That's what I mean when I say about raised by wolves. It was very hands off. So yeah, certainly and that did mean they had to work hard. We didn't really have family holidays for much when I was growing up. I can only remember one or two. So that didn't really happen. And I said it was certainly a benign environment. It's not like they were neglectful at all. The opposite, in fact. But there wasn't any real sort of hands-on, sort of guidance and the rest of it. That didn't really happen.
From as young as you remember?
From as young as I remember, yeah.
And were there rooms at the pub? Or it was just...
There were, but they didn't generally get used. I mean, there was a couple of rooms upstairs for, itinerants, as it were. But, then I think I can only remember them sort of being used once or twice while we were there. So it was a rare thing.
Uh-huh. And on the rugby point, was it just that there weren't parents watching rugby in general, or you felt specifically like you were the one?
I think there were. I mean, it's both things. It's both things, because I think the generational thing, now, or 10 years ago when I was doing that, I think almost every parent was on the touchline, but that just became a sort of an expectation almost. And back then there were parents, but it was much, much less. But that is one of the, I mean, it's not a resentment. It's not something I sort of, that sort of chews me up, because I appreciate it is a generational thing. But in a small way, like it never really showed any interest, and that, again, that's fine. But in a small way, that sort of, to me, it illustrates that, that hands-off approach in a way. It sort of encapsulates it. Because that was the one thing that I could actually do. That's the one thing I was good at school, was sport. And most of the rest of it I couldn't be bothered with.
And it was the same with your brother?
I think so, yes. I mean, my brother, yeah, basically, my brother had a slightly more slightly more rosy progress. I feel like, maybe from my perspective only, but I think it's slightly more rosy, in that he was more, I think, socially adept than I was. So I was a bit, sullen and oppositional, and he wasn't like that. So I think that opened doors and made his passage through youth and childhood probably a bit smoother than mine was.
So did you start getting into trouble?
Yeah, it was all low level. I mean, it was nothing spectacular, unfortunately. It was all low level. It was just kind of low level dissent. It was sort of serial non-compliance, basically. But I did rub up a few of my teachers the wrong way. So there's a few of them that, you had the feeling that they really didn't like you at all. And I used to get very imaginative punishments. One of my teachers once, what the punishment was to clear up his office, and he was a chain smoker, and he had two dogs that used to follow him around, and they had shed their hair and crapped in his office, and he was a chain smoker. So that was a really fun hour, clearing up his office, as you can imagine. Because this is just at the cusp of, where corporal punishment was being sort of phased out. So they had to, I suppose, find more imaginative punishments for errant children. So that's what I had. I don't remember ever. I think I may have got slippered once. That was one thing. But cleaning up your dog crap out of your teacher's office, that was quite a nice punishment.
Huh.
So it was all low level sort of non-compliance, nothing spectacular.
Just being late and stuff.
I suppose being late. Not there was. I think there's a sort of frustration because I sort of sailed through. We had 4 streams, A, B, C, D, and I sort of sailed through in the B stream without really doing any work. And I was probably one of those quite frustrating kids that, they could see that I was reasonably capable and I could probably do quite well. But I just didn't switch on at all. And the moments that I did switch on, I kind of did well. So I must have provided flashes to them of what I was capable of, but all too rarely. So that I was one of those quite annoying kids. I mean, I suppose you can always, as a teacher, you understand the kids that are just, a bit ordinary or a bit dim. That's fine. But the ones that you can see are reasonably, gifted or talented or whatever, but then lazy or just don't do anything with it or don't switch on. I think they must be the sort of frustrating ones. And I think I probably fell into that category.
So did you enjoy school in general?
In general, yeah, I don't think school necessarily enjoyed me, but I enjoyed it. I mean, I enjoyed it because I had good mates from school, and I still have, the same. My most of my friends, as I would call them, are still people that I knew from school. I enjoyed that side of it. I enjoyed, having a laugh with my friends. I did the whole going to lessons and getting exams and so on was a sort of slightly annoying sideshow. But I enjoyed the sort of the social side of school. I don't have sort of negative memories of it at all, even though I didn't achieve much.
There wasn't like a class thing or something with your dad not wanting to go to the rugby, being like from Liverpool?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I can't ask him. But no, you see, class was never a thing. I think a lot of people from the outside, when they look at, the British public school system, i.e. the private schools, they sort of imagine that they must have been and must be kind of dreadfully class riven. And they can't, well, certainly my experience, I can't speak for it now, but, my experience, it just wasn't. Certainly with the kids, you weren't even aware of that, right? So my best mate at school, his dad was a property developer, did very well for himself, had this massive house, up in the hills, in the Chiltern Hills. And we used to go there all the time, and my parents used to drop me off up there. And he had, he had a motorbike, and they had big grounds, and they had dogs, and it was just, it was kind of, it was absolute playground for kids of that age. My parents never made any comment about, oh, isn't he doing well for himself? And there was no sense of, kind of competition or envy or anything like that. None of that came across to me anyway. And we certainly didn't feel it. We didn't feel like, oh, well, I don't belong here because, you've got more money than we have, kind of thing. That it never even occurred to us. So, I don't know. It's understandable, I suppose, that people try and read that into it, but as kids, we just didn't have that sense at all, and I certainly didn't get any inkling of that from my parents either. I mean, if you look at it in terms of the, I suppose the demographics of it, we were, very solidly middle class, but probably to the bottom end of the income bracket that could send a kid to one of those schools. So, if it's in retrospect, it's possible that there might have been some sort of envy element to it, or being intimidated, but never saw that from my parents.
And what were you interested in history at that point?
No, not really. I mean, it was one of those, I'd had various things. If I had a subject that sort of, switched the light on, and I got interested in, then I would do it, and I would do very well. And I remember there was one year that I came top of my class in biology and bottom of the class in chemistry in the same year, which is only kind of explicable by the fact that the biology teacher kind of engaged me, and the chemistry teacher that didn't. So I had a succession of history teachers. I kind of vaguely enjoyed history. It was one of those, okay, that was quite interesting, but the fascination wasn't there. That all came later on. So I said I sort of sailed through school without really engaging, without switching on, without doing much at all. So that came much later on. A sort of an awareness of the world, I suppose. So that came through. Weird things like, my grandmother used to travel a lot, and she used to, again, probably in that sort of didactic way, she used to bring back or send us, me and my brother, these sort of packages of stamps. So I remember having books of stamps, and I used to find that quite fascinating. So that kind of awakened, an interest in the world and in languages as well. How, weird things as a kid. Weird things like how countries describe themselves in their own language, things like that. Like Suomi for Finland, for example. And when you're collecting stamps, you kind of work that out quite early, and I think it does provide a little opening into another world, which some people don't find interesting. I found quite fascinating. So things like that I quite enjoyed. And then a lot of the stamps have national symbols, or they have commemoration of historic events or historic individuals and stuff like that. So all of that stuff, I found all that quite interesting. So there's a sort of an awareness of the world that I think that kind of brought out in me. But none of this was sort of, none of it was realized really until later on.
And where were your family holidays when you went on them?
Yeah, well, they didn't, as I said, they didn't really happen. There was one, I was told about one that we went to the Channel Islands once. And then there was the one that I can remember, we went to Italy, and that was quite catastrophic. And I think at the end of it, I think my dad said, oh, well, I'm never doing that again. Because I think 2 teenage boys was all a bit stressful for him. And, his life was fairly stressful anyway. So he didn't want stress when he went on holiday. So I think the line then was, well, I'm not doing that ever again. And I don't think he did. So after that, so even when I was as a teenager, so sort of mid-teens. So my parents used to go on holiday on their own, and then we'd just have someone would come in and sort of would come in and run the pub, and I can't remember what we'd end up doing. There's a couple of times like we used to go and stay with my grandmother, for example, while my parents went on holiday. So that's how it was. Wolves, as I say.
Got it. Okay, so what was the experience as a car mechanic like? Were you genuinely happy to go in that direction, and you were like, this will be my life? Or was it kind of like school pissed you off, but then you made the decision and you couldn't go back on it?
No, I enjoyed it. Because I still had that fascination that had led me in that direction in the first place. So I enjoyed it initially. I did have a moment after probably about a year or so where I kind of stopped and I thought, well, am I really going to do this for the next 40 years? And my answer to that question, however ill-formed at the time, was basically no. So I think I sort of realized I did fundamentally enjoy it. I enjoyed the sort of, the banter and the sort of camaraderie and all of that, as much as anything. So that was great fun. But yeah, I think I realized fairly soon that wasn't going to be my life. So when I then fell out with one of my bosses, who was a bit of an arse, and we had a bit of a to-do, and I remember I went home at lunchtime, walked home at lunchtime, and scribbled out a resignation and took it back into his office in the afternoon. And sort of, by the next week I was gone, sort of thing. And that was the end of that. And, it was fine. At that age,
What was it about?
I can't remember. I mean, he was a very sort of cantankerous guy. He was quite arrogant. And he was the service manager, and he used to come into the workshop and basically sort of storm around and shout about, why isn't this ready? And why hasn't that been done? And, what are you doing? And, everybody hated him. And I can't remember what it was, but I must have answered back or said something, or he'd said something to me that kind of ticked me off enough that I reacted like that. I just said, I'm not having that. So, so I just left. But you can do these sort of impetuous things when you're sort of 17, 18 and, and stupid.
So then what did you do?
Then I did various things. I worked in a pub. I went and worked for Ratner's Jewelers for a while. I was one of their sort of apprentice or became an assistant manager. But that was actually quite fun. And I used to be in charge of the watches in a big shop in Portsmouth. I had a big shop in Portsmouth then. And I used to be in charge of that, which was really good. And I got a real sort of buzz out of that side of things. Enjoyed selling watches and, learning all about, the watch business. So that I really enjoyed. Did that for a couple of years. And that sort of brought me up to, again, I fell out with one of my bosses there as well. That's why I left that one. It's a bit of a theme.
How? Wait, how did you end up there? So you moved to Portsmouth?
Yeah, I moved there. Well, that was with my then girlfriend, now wife. So she went to university in Portsmouth and was having a tough time. So I basically moved down there to sort of try and, help her through it, sort of thing. So I was working in the shop in Portsmouth there. So that was quite fun. We were there for a couple of years, 3 years. And by the end, I'd as I said, I'd fallen out with my boss again and resigned. And at the end of that period, so this is kind of getting into where I had this, the great turn, as it were. At the end of that period, I was actually working on Portsmouth docks, which was quite fun. Again, nothing terribly kind of, manly. I was sort of running documents between office and, whatever it was, between offices in the docks. So I wasn't doing anything, really physical. But it still always sounds quite good if you say you're working on the docks.
It does.
but that was that then is coming up to the change, as it were, which was 89, and 89 was a really seminal year, because that was the revolution in Eastern Europe, revolutions in Eastern Europe, which I've found absolutely fascinating. That's the first time, really, as I said earlier on with school, I was never really sort of switched on. I never had that light come on and, oh my God, this is fascinating. And then that was the first moment that I had that. So you sort of, through 89, you watched, or one watched, these, the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, tottering first, and trying, in some cases, sort of trying to reform and trying to enable themselves to survive and so on, and then collapsing one by one, most famously the Berlin Wall in November, and then Ceausescu falling and being executed at the end of December 89. And from the outside, sort of watching that, I used to find that the whole thing so fascinating that I used to come back from work to put the telly on to sort of find out what had happened today, kind of thing, and it became kind of strangely sort of all consuming. I just really found it fascinating, and I wanted to, and I sort of decided I really want to know more about this. I want to study this, do something in this sort of area, just find out more about it. And I did a A-level history at that time. Now I'd already sort of done a bit of study, so I'd sort of got back into the groove of learning, I suppose. I had to do a couple of professional courses with the jewelry business and the watch business, so I'd kind of been doing these courses to get qualifications that they thought were necessary, and I kind of enjoyed that. I'd enjoyed the adult learning and the environment and so on, and achieving something in that respect. So I suppose a bit of maturity by that stage. And when those courses finished, then I remember thinking, and I think it's probably about the time I'd left, and I thought, well, I quite enjoyed that. Let's do something else. Let's do like evening classes or something. And I lit upon, really not with any design at all, I lit upon doing history A-level, modern history, at the local sort of FE college. And that was like, really, I loved it. It was great fun. I had a great teacher who was really kind of dynamic and fun, and and a little bit daft. So he made it sort of funny, and and really enjoyed it. And he was really helpful. So I remember him, he used to say, well, because if you bear in mind the sort of people that do FE night school courses like that, very often they're told they have to, and they might only turn up 3 times, and then they'll bunk the exam or whatever. So
By an employer.
Sorry,
they have to from an employer.
Yeah, maybe something like that. So that all human life is there, basically, from the people that don't want to be there but have to people who really do want to try and get something out of it and are just fascinated or whatever. So we started off, for example, with maybe 30 kids, or for young people in the class that year. And by the time you had to pay the bill for the year, for example, the population of the class dropped by half. So a lot of them were just sort of trying it out, and I think as soon as you have to pay, that's it, I'm out. And then by the time we sat the exam, there was probably 6 of us, and one of those, saw the paper and walked out. So, the attrition rate is horrific in those courses. But the teacher was really good. It's only a year, so it's like an hour and a half a week for a year to do an A-level. And the teacher was really good. So I remember him saying, he used to say to us, well, if I don't demand that you write essays, but given that you've got to write essays in the exam, it would be helpful. But he can't demand anything because people would just leave. So he said, well, if you want to write essays, I will mark them, but I'm not demanding that you do. So being the sort of the keen one, and the quite excited by the whole prospect of being back in education, I used to write essays. And I remember he sort of asked me once to stay behind, and he said, are you thinking about going to university? And it was probably the first time I'd actually heard the word university. And I said, no, I wasn't. And he said, oh, well, I think you should. And that's the first time I'd actually kind of thought about it at all. And I was just literally following my nose, enjoying myself, being interested in the subject. And that sort of planted a seed. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. And that would be then I could sort of follow my nose through into this sort of fascinating world that I'd found. So I looked into it, and I passed the exam at the end of the year, and on the back of that, applied to university to go and specifically study Central European, Central and East European studies, and was quite sort of bolshy because I was, I had my precious 1 A level, which nominally is not enough to get into university, but they, with mature students, and I was about 21 by then, so that classified you as a mature student. Then they basically kind of were willing to waive most of the entry requirements if they thought you were, sufficiently capable. So, I sort of applied to various places, LSE, others, ended up at the School of Slavonic Studies in London, which was doing exactly what I wanted to do, which was Central European history. That was my fascination, and it still is to a large extent. And that was that, as I said, that was my sort of great turn. That was the moment where the slightly feckless, aimless youth began to morph into a historian.
So what were you learning about in modern history at that point? Was it mainly World War I, or it was World War II as well?
Yeah, it was 19th and 20th century, German reunification, I remember, Italian reunification or Italian unification was one of them. So yeah, those, general general European history. It wasn't Central European. It wasn't the stuff that I really wanted to do. But it was a decent grounding in sort of European history. So yeah, it wasn't bang on subject, but it was still, fascinating enough. I suppose, you could say with that teacher that did the evening classes, had he been different, then everything could have been different. If he'd been a different kind of guy, and we hadn't hit it off, I suppose, in the way we did, then again, that could have been a different turning point, or not a turning point.
And what was specifically interesting to you about what was happening in 89?
I think there's two things. I always have this sense or sort of fascination with things that you're almost not allowed to know about. The things that nobody else knows about. That I find it has that sort of frisson of the hidden away. And Central Europe was like that, because for so long, for 2 generations, this has all been sort of disappeared behind the Iron Curtain and so on. It was, you couldn't just get on a plane and travel there. It was very controlled. You didn't meet people from Poland or Czechoslovakia or whatever like that. It just didn't happen. It was somewhere that was at the same time familiar because it was all part of Europe and you knew where it was on the map, and yet it was like terra incognita, and that as soon as my eyes were sort of open to that, I thought, wow, this is all really interesting. So that element I thought was fascinating. And then more than that, I suppose it was that aspect where when you see those regimes collapsing in slow motion and then very much in fast motion in 1989, it was that sense that you were witnessing history in real time. You were witnessing historic, fundamental change, and more than that, those regimes that had been in power through the Cold War and had gave every impression of being absolutely permanent. They weren't going anywhere. They weren't temporary. And yet you can see how they collapsed. And of course, all these things had a very long tail, as I later discovered. But it looked like they collapsed almost over one season, over one half a year, and one after the other collapsed. And it was like all that stuff that you thought was absolutely permanent was not. And that made me want to know how that all happened. How did it come into being in the first place? How did that happen? How did the collapse happen? So I was just sort of, I used to buy books about it, and all that sort of early journalism about Timothy Garton Ash, that sort of thing that was coming out at the time, about the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, about Václav Havel, all of that stuff, Solidarity, about Ceausescu's Romania. I was just sort of lapping up all of that stuff that came out at the same time. So it was the exoticism, I suppose, comparatively, of Central Europe, in that you weren't allowed to know about it, or it was hard to know about. And then that aspect of history changing before your very eyes.
And it was obvious that you were becoming like way more obsessed with it than the average news watcher.
Yeah, I think that was probably fairly obvious. I just found it fascinating, and it was that moment that I never experienced really at school, of a light going on and finding the thing that you're really interested in. And at the same time, I suppose, having, for one thing, the ability and also the opportunity to pursue it. So one of the things that I'm sort of most, in a sense, in retrospect, sort of pleased about, is that when that light came on for me, I wasn't tied down, with a job and, 6 kids and a huge mortgage and all of that, and in a situation where I couldn't then follow my nose and follow my passion. So luckily for me, I was still, rented accommodation, girlfriend, and all of that, but I was still in a position where I could pursue it. So I did, and that was a great boon.
And your wife was supportive of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So that was never really a question. That was, and to a large extent, I think she sort of shared that fascination as well. We this was after '89, but we went to Central Europe and had little trips and holidays and stuff like that. So we used to do all of that. She is half German, so her mother's German, so she kind of already has one foot in that world anyway. So it was a very much a sort of shared fascination, I think.
So during that time when you were working in various jobs, were you like worried about what your future would be, or was like, I'll just keep trying stuff and then?
No, never was at all. No. So I left home when I was 17. And my parents then subsequently moved. So they had financial trouble. So my dad retired and so on. There was a tax bill related to the pub and so on. So they retired away to Suffolk. So they had to sell the house and move to Suffolk. And in the process, they basically kind of either gave away or sold all my stuff. So I was left from about the age of 17, pretty much with just my car and whatever I had in my car when I left home, which was a couple of suitcases and a stereo. So that was almost, it was kind of like it's like I was uprooted in a good and bad sense at that point. So from then on, doing various jobs, and then soon after that, I moved down to Portsmouth, as I said. And no, I was never bothered about, the future, and I was always just following your nose, and I suppose it's partly that aspect that I said, that I didn't really feel like I'd found the thing. So it's only when I found the thing that I sort of began to think about what seriously to do next and how to pursue that. So prior to that, it was just kind of following your nose.
So what was uni like?
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I was though one of those, I was 21, I think 21, 22 when I started uni. And the 4 years difference to, the average 18-year-old straight out of school, which, 4 years doesn't sound massive, but, I'd been working and, living away from home basically for, more or less 6 years. So there was, in that sense, there was a huge difference, I think, in sort of maturity. And I just loved it. So I used to, I was that guy that used to go to other people's lectures, because I thought they sounded interesting. Where, some of my mates at the time, would struggle to get up for a 9 o'clock. I was going to other people's 9 o'clocks. It was that I was that guy. It was like a sort of intellectual sweet shop to me. I did sort of evening classes in Russian for a while. I did evening classes in German. I just absolutely loved it. All the way through, and I did really well as well. I was kind of, in terms of getting good results and so on, and I suppose that then led on to the next thing. That sort of as a positive experience that led on to, working with Norman Davies, who was one of my lecturers there. So he saw that. I suppose he saw that enthusiasm and that modicum of ability, certainly, but certainly the enthusiasm.
And how did you support yourself during uni?
Okay, that's a question. Back in those days, we had grants. So I didn't work. I did work in the summers. I worked in the summers. So I worked on a farm for a while. I worked on there was a kids project in the East End that I worked on a couple of years running. So I did work in the summers, but I didn't work in term time. So we had grants in those days, not even loans. I think actually, no, there was a loan. I did have a loan. Yeah, there was a loan. I wish I'd paid off a long time ago. So it was that period of that switch between grants and loans. And I think they were phasing in loans. So no, it was relatively easy. It didn't feel like it was financially difficult, but I was fully independent by that point, so there was no sort of family help at all. It was all said grants, loans, and work in the summer.
Great. That's so good that you were able to, you're so interested in history, could just do the one A level and then get into uni, and then they made it, possible for you financially and everything.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's before the sort of mass explosion of the university system, which was later in the 90s. This was the early 90s, of course, which made my experience of doing that from a financial perspective would be, is not sustainable. You couldn't do that now, because it's all on loans and so on. So it'd be much more difficult. But because you still had that element of a proportion of the cost was covered by grants, it made it possible. Yeah, but it was it's tremendous, tremendously good. And as I said, the timing was crucial, for me as well, to that I wasn't in a situation where I couldn't take that opportunity. So in terms of where I was in my life, it was also very serendipitous.
And then, so has the story from that point just been, you've just continued to follow your curiosity and...
Yeah, largely. And it does feel, again, I in one sense, I sort of don't, I'm still the same person, and I still have the same fascination. And each of the projects that I work on, each of the books I work on is exercising that fascination, so there is to me, there's sort of a continuum with the university. It's not, I mean, you could say I'm still the same guy maybe, but obviously things change, but I still feel like I have the same enthusiasm, and I'm still in the same place in my head, which is exercising that enthusiasm. And then the great again, another piece of good fortune was ending up working with Norman Davies for a few years, which was tremendous kind of really an apprenticeship, I suppose. He sort of I first did his course in the third year, did his modern Poland course, which I found fascinating. and he sort of picked me up, and he asked me to do some work for him. He was doing one of his big books. I think that was Europe: A History, which came out around that time, early 90s. And he was, finishing that off and needed some help with, various things, compiling the index, for example. I did that, and then I did a lot of the appendices and things like that. So a lot of the sort of donkey work. But he asked me if I wanted to do it, which of course you don't turn that down, and he was paying, so that was good. And that started a sort of professional relationship that lasted, I was at his 85th birthday not long ago, so it's really lasted more or less until today. So it was a real apprenticeship in that sense, that the whole business of researching, writing, how do you construct a book? How do you construct a chapter? How do you go about it? We co-authored together. Book came out in 2001 on the history of Wrocław. And that was really my sort of elevation into not just being fascinated in history, but actually, becoming a historian, in fact.
And did you ever think that could happen at the point that you were just finishing uni?
No, I did, finishing uni, I did have the same as everyone finishing uni. I thought, well, what now? I did want to stay essentially doing what I was doing, because I really enjoyed it. But then you've got the problem of how do you make it pay? I did consider going into education as a teacher, but there was teacher was one thing, and then there was the other one of staying on. I did do a master's, but staying on doing a PhD and going into academia, which I sort of dallied with for a while, and then that didn't. I tried to do PhD on the side, that didn't work. There's not enough hours in the day, really. But the in a sense, doing the work for Norman as a research assistant it allowed me to stay in that place, in the business, and in that, doing stuff that I was interested in and fascinated by, and get paid for it. So that enabled me, at least in the short term, to carry on in the business and to find that way forward. And it was never going to be forever. I could see that, but it was for the meantime, it was all good. I was in the business, I was learning valuable stuff, and I was getting paid for it. So, what's not to like? So that was a relatively easy decision. As I said, I did dabble with doing a PhD, which I sort of gave up after a while, and realized I didn't have enough hours to sort of pursue it. And then, pretty soon we co-authored, and then on the back of that, I put a proposal in for my first book. And that was picked up. And then, once you're sort of in the system, in that sense, you're in the system, and you don't look back. But it's all about, I suppose it's about those moments. It's about, that having the good fortune to meet Norman when I did, to have had that tutor when I did, for the A level. And again, I mean, when you look, I suppose when someone from the outside looks at a life or a career like that, it all seems very kind of straight, very linear, very straight lines, and everything makes sense. But when you live it, it's a lot more zigzags and dead ends, and then you do see those moments where it is serendipity to some extent, that that you're in the right place at the right time. You've still got to deliver. You've still got to, serendipity can open the door, but you've still got to walk through, and you've still got to deliver. But there are a few moments that, I can see that it really was good fortune that I was in the right place at the right time.
But I guess you kind of had the backup options, like you were keeping doors open. It wasn't like I have to be a published author, or like that's it. Like it's like you had the PhD door, and you would consider education.
I suppose I had other possibilities, however slightly tenuous they might have been, like the PhD, for example. but I know I was never really. It's funny. I was at a dinner the other day, and I was a very young historian next to me, and she was talking about, thinking strategically. That was the phrase she used, thinking strategically about her career. And I sort of did a double take, and I thought, I don't think I've ever thought strategically in my life. Right? I've never had a plan, and I know that's probably sounds awful. But I just haven't. I've just followed my nose, and I've done what I enjoy doing. And it's a great luxury to be able to do that, of course. But maybe if I had a plan, I could have achieved a lot more. I don't know, but I've just never had one. I've never thought strategically in my life.
What would achieving a lot more look like?
I don't know. Nobel Prize? I've no idea. I mean, you can this thing. I mean, authors. I think these days, since publishing is much more cutthroat than it used to be. Just being in the business, still in the business now as a freelance as well, is kind of a win, right? That I take as a win every day. And you can always say, well, you want to be more successful, and you want to be in the bestseller charts and all the rest of it, and you want to command bigger advances. Yeah, okay, that's always good, and we can realistically hope for those things and work towards those things. But what does it look like? I don't know. I mean, I've one of my books won an award, so that's one sort of box ticked. I even won a medal a few years ago. I won a medal from the Republic of Poland. If you had a box for win medal in your career, then I've ticked that one as well. So that's nice. That's a lovely thing to have that sort of recognition. So what would it look like? I don't know, just sort of more of the same, but better, and with more zeros at the end.
Wait, what do you mean by freelance? What's the alternative to that?
Well, as an academic, I suppose anyone, really, as an author, most of us are freelance. But then, as an academic, so employed by an institution. But then you wouldn't really be a writer; you'd be writing on the side, right? So no, that is the sort of the perilous aspect of it, I suppose. It's quite financially perilous that you are living by the pen. I do have a toe in academia, so I do teach a course as a visiting professor in Warsaw. So again, it's all come full circle, back to Warsaw. So I do that every spring, which is great fun. I enjoy doing that. Teach a course about totalitarianism. So I've still got I've got a toe in academia, which just basically means that a lot of Poles and Polish media and so on insist on calling me professor, and I've kind of given up correcting them.
And how would the subjects of the books come about?
Again, it's me following my nose. So there's no real again, that phrase, thinking strategically, didn't happen. So the first book I did on my own was Killing Hitler, about the assassination attempts on Hitler. The idea for that came to me in the shower. And then I did Berlin at War because I thought that was, I'm always looking for an area that hasn't been done. So the big sort of horror for me is being asked to do a sort of a synthesis of something that's well covered already, and there's nothing new to be said, and there's no new perspective. It always baffles me that every year we have probably 3 or 4 new books on the Dam Busters raid in Britain. And I kind of get the idea of established brands in publishing, as in established ideas and concepts and events that the publishers all want to cover and over again. But if there's nothing new to say, and if there's no new material of significance, then what is the point? What's the point in reading it? What's the point in commissioning it? And more significantly, what's the point in writing it? So I never want to be doing that sort of thing. I always want to try and find a subject, and ideally one that's relatively well known, but then you sort of flip the perspective, right? So you're contributing something new in that respect, or you're genuinely filling a hole, right? You're filling a gap in the narrative that for whatever reason we've collectively forgotten about. So I think all of my books kind of fit into those categories. So I always do want to genuinely try and contribute something of significance, as well as trying. It sounds quite pious, I know, but as well as trying to make it as accessible as possible. All of that stuff that we talked about at the beginning, courtesy of AI. So I'm always trying to do that, trying to fill the gaps or to provide a new perspective.
Mm-hmm. And what? So you are just reading so much history, or at the point of your first book, it's like you would have just been reading so much, so what's been written and what hasn't been written.
On that subject, yeah, I think there's a misconception sometimes that people imagine historians are experts in absolutely everything. I mean, I can only speak for myself, and I'm absolutely not. So you can kind of be on top of the literature in a handful of areas. And at that time, I remember thinking, I thought I'd had the idea in the shower, but I was thinking about Stauffenberg, Count von Stauffenberg, Hitler's most famous would-be assassin. I was thinking about him while I was in the shower for some reason. I'm sure you're probably the same, Dealer. I'm sure you think about him when you're in the shower all the time. But I did. And then I was thinking about, well, there was that other guy that tried to kill him. And then there was that other one. And I suddenly thought, okay, that's kind of a book. Like by the time I stepped out of the shower, I had like a chapter structure and everything. So it just all sort of fell together. I thought, actually, they're really interesting stories. They're really dramatic, of course, by their very nature. In a sense, the thrust of the thing was that the story of Stauffenberg, because it's so well known in comparison to the others, it's sort of it's the tree that obscures the forest in a way. You see that one. All the attention is focused on that one, and in the process, all the others are forgotten. So I wanted to try and raise some of the other events and the other would-be assassins and the would-be plotters and so on to a sort of similar status or similar level of recognition that Stauffenberg received. So that was the sort of the idea behind that one. But as I say, you just it's about trying to sort of fill gaps. So when I switched to doing a lot of Polish stuff, the current book I've gone back to doing German stuff, but the last 3 books effectively have been on Polish stuff. And that's just, where I'm sort of going back in a way to my roots, if you like. And that's the stuff that I find really interesting. It is a tougher sell. It's a tougher sell in the marketplace. The publishers are less interested in that, unfortunately. The public is less interested in it, but I'm very proud of those books, and I think that the idea of trying to drag readers and say, look, you know all about Nazi Germany, or about World War II, but to try and say, okay, that's fine, but let's just pull you eastwards. Let's pull you across into occupied Poland, historically speaking. What do you know about that? And most people go, well, we know nothing about that. I say that's insane that you know everything about one, and then you move 10 miles to the east and you know nothing about it. And they're all everything's related and connected, of course. So in a sense, I want to try and drag those readers eastward and say, you think this period is interesting, you look at this stuff. This is fascinating, right? So in a sense, that's what I'm trying to do. And in the process, you can fill gaps. And, that's what my book on the September campaign was, because that was a massive gap. That's the first military campaign of the war. September 39, the invasion of Poland. The English-speaking outside world kind of knows nothing about it, and we really should. I mean, it's the reason Britain and France go to war in 39 is to defend Poland. So we should at least know what Poland was doing and what it was going through and what it was enduring in that time. Now, it should be part of the historical narrative, and it just hasn't been. So that's an example of wanting to fill a gap, which I think I did.
Okay, this might be a stupid question, but for the Hitler assassination stuff, how did you know about all the other assassination, if they haven't really been written about, is it just like you know about them through what, like primary sources, or they're kind of mentioned here and there, but
Yeah,
no
they're
one's
sort of
gone into
yeah.
detail?
Well, they're sort of mentioned. Yeah, you're right. They're sort of mentioned here and there. So, um, the weird situation there was that someone like Stauffenberg had books written about him, films about him, and so on. So he was very, very prominent. But the other big assassin, the next one down that came closest to killing him was a guy called Georg Elser, and he planted a bomb in a beer hall in 1939. Now, this story is now relatively well known because I wrote the book, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, he was very much kind of confined to the footnotes of history. So you might get, a paragraph in a history book, but he didn't get a whole book to himself. So in a sense, it's that disparity that sort of motivated the book, because I thought, his is a really, really interesting story. Look at his motivations, look at how close he came to actually, carrying out the assassination. He did, the bomb exploded and people were killed and all the rest of it. Hitler had gone by that stage, had left the building 13 minutes earlier, right? So it's a fascinating story, and it deserves mentioning in the same breath as Stauffenberg, I would say. So that was the sort of reason for the book. So the other ones, and then there's like Hans Oster and Henning von Treschow was another Wehrmacht colonel who was or major general who was very prominent in the military resistance, and again doesn't get the recognition that he should have. So these were people, as you say, who were kind of mentioned in asides, but without being the main focus. So I tried to turn that around.
Is this the book, by the way? Is that true that it was it Gaddafi's desk?
Yeah, it was. That was Killing Hitler. So yeah, I saw that. It was quite funny a few years ago. It was when Libya was blowing up, if you remember, which must be at 2011, 2012, something like that. And I had this phone call it was actually from my father-in-law, and he was very excited on the phone, and he said, "I'm going to send you something. I found something online." I said, "Okay," and he sent this link through, and it was to a CNN report of a guy on the ground in Libya, and he was breaking into Sadi Gaddafi's office, being Gaddafi Senior's son. And he sort of went up, the house is the palace is kind of in, it's been wrecked and looted and so on. And he goes into his office, and there's a couple of books there, and one of them was Secrets of Leadership or something, I think, by Colin Powell. And then he picks up this book, and it's a copy of Killing Hitler, and he says, "Look at this. This must be the last book he was reading before he fled." So it was, and it was one of those moments, because I wasn't apprised of what the punchline was before I was actually watching this video. So it was one of those moments where you kind of yelped with excitement. Yeah, that was quite exciting. So yeah, no, it's just it's a sort of throwaway thing. It doesn't make any difference to anybody or to your career, but it's quite an exciting thing when you see that.
And all very interesting, considering the recent assassination attempt on Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite thought provoking. I was thinking the other day when I woke up and heard about the Trump assassination attempt, and that whole thing about him. I mean, there's a couple of parallels there that I thought were irresistible to one of the attempted assassinations of Mussolini in 1926, where he was there was an Irish woman by the name of Violet Gibson who tried to assassinate Mussolini, and she fired a pistol at him at relatively close range, and at the last moment he was distracted and he turned his head in exactly the same way as Trump did.
Wow.
And consequently, Mussolini was grazed across the bridge of his nose by this bullet, which otherwise would have pretty much taken his head off. So it's exactly the same scenario as Trump. Had he not moved his head in the way that he did last Saturday, the bullet would probably have taken his head off. So the parallel I thought was that immediate parallel struck me when I heard the news, and then when you look into it, Trump, that scene and that photograph, which is absolutely iconic, isn't it? Of the flag and then Trump with his fist up and all of that and bloodied across his ear. I mean, it's one of those pictures, a bit like the American troops raising the flag at, I think it's Okinawa, was it? I mean, that is, it's one of those seminal photographs. Absolutely incredible. But where he was, even at that moment, he's still kind of, I suppose, what would you say, propagandizing, almost proselytizing. He's still fight, all of that stuff. And again, Mussolini did the same thing. I'm not comparing Trump and Mussolini, by the way, but there are some very interesting sort of superficial parallels here.
Interesting. Yeah, that is incredible looking at the footage. And in that moment, you can see him like, stop to the Secret Service. I need to like show something, show a sign of strength to the crowd, which is like, whatever you think of Trump, like imagining anyone being like shot in the ear and then seconds later being like, I need to rally the crowd.
Yeah.
Is crazy. Okay. I'll ask you the last 3 questions.
Yeah, go on.
But wait, first I just want to, because you were saying about how your books try to have this different perspective that people haven't heard. So can I just tell you what I learned from the Forgers, and you can correct me if it's totally wrong?
Yeah.
Well, so it was so interesting and sad to hear. I think I kind of knew that the world kind of rejected these, all the Jewish refugees, but I didn't realize the extent of the situation, that it was like, yeah, they were basically stateless because the law was made like that. And then all the countries kind of met up. They knew there was an issue. I didn't realize as well that they knew what was going on in the camps like so early, but they didn't believe it because it was like they reported 700,000 Jews had been killed, and it was just like, no way, like there's no way that's true.
That can't be true. Yeah.
So, and then the world like meets and they're like, oh, what can we do with these Jewish people? Like no one, oh, what a bad problem, but no one's actually offering to help. And then, so all these Jewish people are being exterminated, as we know, in the concentration camps. But if they got a passport, so the book is about this operation of a Polish diplomat in Switzerland who was giving fake passports. And the idea was to like Paraguay and Latin American countries. And the idea was if they had a passport, they wouldn't be executed because they could be used to trade potentially for Germans who were in the Allied countries. So, and even though they weren't necessarily ever used in a trade, or only very small number of them were,
very few,
they were let to continue living, or they weren't sent to the camps. So this fake piece of paper, and like they never had to travel to Latin America or whatever. But so this fake piece of paper saved them, and no one really knew about this until, because obviously it had to be a secret while it was happening. And then no one really told this story until you wrote the book.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's a fabulous story. It really is. When I heard about that. That was one I didn't sniff that one out. That was presented to me, really. I was just finishing the previous book, so I think I had the proofs on my desk of First to Fight on September 39. And I had an email from a friend of mine saying, this story is kind of breaking. What do you think of it? And I sort of sent a couple of links, and I looked at the links and I thought, oh, it's a great story. And it did to me, in a sense, I'd kind of written a lot when you write about Nazi Germany and Poland during World War II. You're sort of, at the dark heart of all of that was the Holocaust. Half of the Jews of the Holocaust were Polish Jews, killed in the Holocaust, Polish Jews. So in a sense, I'd been sort of swirling around the Holocaust with a lot of the work that I'd done up until that point. But as I said before, the idea of just doing yet another synthesis on the Holocaust didn't really appeal at all. So what this book and this project allowed me to do was to have a specific focus on that rescue operation, which is a really fascinating story in its own right and deserves to be known and deserves to be out there. So that sort of ticked the box of new material. But then at the same time, to sort of slot that slightly narrower narrative into a wider, in a sense, retelling or synthesis of the Holocaust. So in a sense that it kind of ticked a couple of boxes for me. But it is a great story, and it actually, in terms of giving a different perspective, I think there's a rather lazy assumption that we have now, because the Holocaust is so prominent in our collective consciousness. I think there's a sort of lazy assumption when we look back with 2020 hindsight, and we think, well, the outside world, we must have been willing to help, and we just couldn't because of logistics, because of it was kept secret or whatever. And when you look into it, as this book requires you to do, you realize that's not the case. That, and as you said, the outside world knows essentially about the ongoing Holocaust at the end of 1942, which is really quite early. And beyond that point, there's no excuse for anyone to be able to claim really ignorance of what's going on. We don't know the chapter and verse necessarily about the numbers or precisely how they're being killed or whatever, but it's happening. We know it's happening. And then you've got the question of what the outside world does about it, which is generally precisely nothing. Which is a sort of slap in the face for that lazy assumption, as I said, that I'm sure we must have been positively predisposed and willing to help. We just couldn't for whatever reason. No, we couldn't because of, I would argue, because of latent anti-Semitism. Again, it's another topic that's come to the fore recently in a way that I think everybody thought it was consigned to history, but obviously not, and troublingly so. But yeah, so I think that I found that a fascinating subject to research and write. The great challenge of it was, I mean, there's two challenges. The first one is to, that the story itself of the operation is all very archival. So a lot of that material is sort of buried in the archives. So you've got all of that mass of material to try and boil down. And then you've got the slotting of it into the wider history of the narrative of the Holocaust. So that means boiling down that aspect, and countless books and material on various aspects of the Holocaust. So, it was challenging on a number of levels, but I'm very proud of it. I think it's a really good book. My great hope is that at some point down the line, I'll receive an email from someone and will say, read your book. Dawned on me that this is, my grandfather was one of those that had one of your passports. And I think that's entirely possible, and I look forward to hearing that. But it's entirely possible because it was kept secret for so long,
Okay, wait, and just to close the loop on the 89 interest to then World War II, was that because as you start digging in, it's like then you get back to World War II and it's like, okay, this is where so much stuff happened that then is relevant to what happened later.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It's in large part that. There is very obviously a Western war and an Eastern war in World War II in Europe. The Western war is relatively humane and chivalrous. Right? They don't tend to massacre civilian populations. They don't tend to massacre POWs. It does happen, but it's not the norm. In Eastern Europe, that's the norm, right? So consequently, if you look, the first impetus for that fascination was 89, and how did we get here? So much of that, in answering how did we get here, leads back to World War II. It leads back to the horrors of, German occupation, also of Soviet occupation. It leads back to the Holocaust. It leads back to the Cold War and the sort of, the cutting off of which is a result of World War II as well. So that in large part it is that, and then in smaller part it is that is still, World War II in Central Europe is still a reasonable sell for a publisher. It still has a market, for a readership. So it would be comparatively harder to get a book away and to get a decent readership on something on 89, because people are, at the end of the day, unfortunately, Central Europe, for all my efforts and those of Norman and many other, much more significant writers than me, Central Europe is still kind of the neglected corner of Europe, unfortunately, or Eastern Europe. So it's still a tougher sell. So World War II, in that respect, at least is sort of guaranteed a market. So there's a sort of cynical aspect to it as well, to some extent.
Yeah, it's probably something we need to learn more about, though.
Absolutely.
Like communism and why it's maybe not so great.
Indeed.
Okay. Last 3 questions. Sorry, I'm taking far too much time.
It's all right.
How do you stay grounded?
How do I stay grounded? I still live pretty much in the town that I grew up in. So, and I really quite enjoy being anonymous. So I work in my shed. I basically have my head down pretty much every day. I don't have a problem being grounded, basically, is the answer to that question. Because I don't have grand ambitions to be on television. I would love to be. I always think there's you'd love to be like the drummer in a rock band where you get a share of all the royalties, but nobody actually knows who you are. Do you know what I mean? Like Charlie Watts used to be with the Rolling Stones. That I always think would be the ideal situation, that you can be completely anonymous, nobody would bother you in the street, but actually, it's like, you've got sort of hidden powers. So I don't have a problem being grounded. I still live here. I still walk the dog. I don't know, naturally grounded. So I don't need to ground myself terribly much.
It's so interesting. I feel like half the people interpret the question the way you're interpreting it, and then the other half who have like me, who are, I don't know, have had various issues, interpreted as like, oh yeah, I have to meditate every day and exercise, and otherwise my emotions like take over. But this is great. As in, whatever it is. No, but you already have the attitude to life. That's what I was going to say. Your approach of not strategizing. Yeah, I feel like the people like me who spend too much time in their head trying to strategize everything and then life is falling apart constantly.
Yeah.
Have to stay grounded.
Yeah.
But if you're already just like not strategizing, that is the way to go, because life is impossible to plan for.
Yeah. And I think if anything, for me, I mean, it's interesting in thinking of the answer to that question. If anything, I probably should, I don't know without sounding arrogant, but I should probably be a bit less grounded, and I should probably think more strategically, to go back to that conversation as well. But it's just never been part of my makeup. And I often kind of beat myself up about it. And I think for a long time I put it down to, that this sort of middle class laziness, because you've never been hungry, right? Literally or metaphorically. Whereas you can see people that come from nothing and they absolutely strive and they grab everything with both hands. And as someone that grew up in the sort of British home counties middle class, I never had that. And I don't know. is that a failing or is that just who you are? I don't know. But yeah, strange.
I think it's just a personality thing, and it's fine. Like,
Good. Thanks, Delia.
well, because unless you're massively suffering, it's like great. That like how you're living is kind of how people want to live, like
Yeah,
free from
absolutely.
suffering and
Yeah,
anxiety about the future.
yeah, absolutely. No, it's a good
Okay,
thing. It's a good thing. But adversity can bring another aspect into somebody's character, and a sort of an urgency and a fire in the belly and all of that. And that's one of those things that I think I kind of missed. But then again, is that just circumstances, or is that just who you are? That's the one I can't square.
Mm. Okay, do you only read history?
No, I don't. I read biography. I tend to stick to non-fiction generally, so I read biographies as well. I do very occasionally. I have a soft spot for um, two authors. I mean, one of whom I read a lot when I was younger, and I haven't been back to. But that's Thomas Hardy. But then I think he was too. It kind of dawned on me he's kind of too flowery in a way that you spend sort of 12 pages describing a hedgerow in a storm before you actually get to the protagonist. And I thought, after a while, I mean, it's beautifully done, but then you just kind of, life's too short. So if I read fiction, I probably default to something like Graham Greene. So I like Graham Greene's style. Stylistically, he's much more punchy and sort of not quite as sort of lapidary as someone like Hemingway, but he's much more sparse in his style. So I like him, and I like that world that he evokes, because it's gone. That world of the sort of fag end of the British Empire, and British junior diplomats in far-flung places who are permanently half drunk and having affairs and all of that. I mean, I'm sure that does happen, but the world that he described has kind of gone, and there's a fascination in sort of seeing that brought to life again. So if I do read non-fiction, it's probably him.
Okay, because the next question is there a book that's had the biggest influence on your life?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. The one I always cite, I've been asked this before, and the one I always cite is a book called Black Sea by Neil Acheson. And Neil Acheson is a British journalist who, I suppose, to some extent, he's older generation than me, but evidently, I think, shared my fascination with Central and Eastern Europe. So he wrote books about Poland in '89 and Solidarity, for example, at the time in the '80s. He was a journalist, I think, for The Observer. That was his sort of day job. And then he wrote a book called Black Sea, which was about the littoral of the Black Sea, so the coast of the Black Sea, all the way around. So that, from Turkey in the south, the Caucasus, Georgia, Russia, Ukraine, and then all round, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria. So, I mean, a huge amount of history in that area. And again, it's kind of closed off really from Western eyes. Nobody's particularly interested. They are a bit now because of Ukraine. But it's a little bit in falls into the same category as this sort of terra incognita for Western eyes. And he wrote this brilliant book called Black Sea, which is basically a mixture of travelogue and history, and it's the people he meets along the way. And it was just brilliant. And I read it when it came out, which must have been, I think, early '90s, I think. And it's always the one I go to when I say, that's for me was one of my sort of inspirational books, because it sort of opened up how fascinating this region is and how complex, and yet you can still write about it in an engaging way. So that was a real sort of lodestar to some extent for me.
Okay, last question. What 3 words describe the best version of Roger?
Oh my God. Oh wow. Wow, that is a very tough question. I think I'd like to think that I'm a fun person to be around. I do cherish humor, both, you know, I love people that make me laugh, and I like making other people laugh. And I like finding the humor in history as well. You know, the sort of, even if it's black, and very often it is black, certainly with the material that I do. So I think humor would, or some variation thereof, would probably be one of those words. I'd like that to be the case. Beyond that, yeah, I would like to, you know, be considered as a, you know, a decent guy. So decent, I suppose. Decent, if that's fair. It's not too wishy-washy. And then the third one, I would love to be my dog. So I'd love to, you know, I think my dog, and I think dogs generally, I think they're amazing. And certainly my dog, I think I would like to have the loyalty and the patience and the good perennial good humor that my dog seems to have, and the enthusiasm for life. So if you know, again, I think my dog is my spiritual lodestar.
Beautiful.
How about that?
Dog-like.
Dog-like,
For your
yeah.
third one.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So anything else? Where can people find you and find your book?
Twitter. So I'm on Twitter at Roger_Moorhouse. So yeah, if you want to know more and want to follow my random interventions on things and sort of historical thoughts, I'm on there. And my website is rogermoorhouse.com, where there's contacts as well, so you get in touch, and links to books and all the rest of it. So yeah, so you know, I hope lots of people listen, and I hope they'll find it interesting, and I hope not too many people sit there and say, well, he sounds like a bit of an arse, because hopefully I don't.